At 10:33 p.m., the American Embassy compound in Baghdad's international zone sat behind its multiple concentric rings of concrete barriers, blast walls, and hardened checkpoints in the specific hush that diplomatic compounds in contested cities develop over years of sustained threat. A quiet that is not peaceful but vigilant, the compound's security staff maintaining their watches with the awareness that the international zone's relative calm had been punctured hundreds of times over 2 decades by rockets, mortars, and improvised munitions. The compound had been hardened incrementally since 2004, its construction shaped by the recurring experience of being targeted, each attack producing an engineering response that had transformed the original buildings into something that required specific and precisely aimed weapons to damage meaningfully. The regional security office staff who maintained the compound's protective posture were professionals at the intersection of security and diplomacy, managing an installation that needed to be simultaneously a functional workplace and a defensible fortress. They had been at elevated alert since the 5th day of the conflict. 412 miles to the northwest, in Beirut's southern suburbs, the American Embassy on the Al-Khar Highway north of the city sat in a different kind of security environment. The Lebanese embassy had been rebuilt and hardened after the 1983 bombing, and again after the 2008 security review that followed regional instability. It was not as hardened as the Baghdad compound. No embassy outside an active combat zone is, but it carried the specific architecture of a facility that had been redesigned with the knowledge that the threat environment was real. 212 personnel, a regional security office of 16, and the formal diplomatic mission of the United States to a country that was hosting, in its southern suburbs, the primary regional manifestation of Hezbollah, an organization that was, at 10:33 p.m., under intense military pressure from Israeli operations in Lebanon and that had publicly pledged solidarity with Iran in the ongoing conflict. The IRGC's planners had debated the embassy targeting for 3 weeks. The political cost of striking American diplomatic facilities was not trivial. The legal and diplomatic consequences of an attack on sovereign American territory would complicate the IRGC's international positioning and would likely harden American domestic political support for the campaign. The military benefit, however, had been assessed as substantial in specific terms. The Baghdad embassy's role as a coordination hub for American intelligence operations in Iraq, the compound housed a CIA station of significant size, meant that its disruption would degrade American collection and analysis of the IRGC's Iraq proxy network at a moment when that network was under sustained pressure from Operation Nightwatch and its successors. The Beirut embassy's disruption would complicate American coordination with the Lebanese government on the politically sensitive question of Hezbollah disarmament, a question whose management had been materially affecting Hezbollah's operational posture in the current conflict. The IRGC's strategic command had weighed the political cost against the operational benefit for 3 weeks and had concluded that the benefit justified the cost. The strikes were authorized. The operation was given its code name in Farsi, which translated roughly as the reach of the righteous. The weapons assigned to the 2 embassy strikes were chosen with specific intent. For Baghdad, 8 Fateh 313 precision ballistic missiles with penetrating warhead variants, the same accuracy that had been used against hardened military infrastructure, now applied against the specific buildings within the embassy compound that intelligence had identified as housing the intelligence operations. For Beirut, 6 Zolfaghar ballistic missiles and 4 terrain-adapted Quds 3 cruise missiles whose approach route had been planned through the Lebanese mountain terrain. The same general concept that had been applied against Muwafaq in Jordan, the terrain-following profile exploiting the ridgelines north of Beirut to mask the approach from the embassy's air defense systems. The launch of the Baghdad element at 10:33 p.m. was detected by the Space Force infrared constellation at 10:33 p.m. and 8 seconds after ignition of the first Fateh 313. The warning reached the Baghdad embassy at 10:33 p.m. and 27 seconds. The Regional Security Office duty officer activated the compound's protective shelter protocol at 10:33 p.m. and 31 seconds. The protocol required all personnel to move to the compound's 3 designated hardened shelter locations within 4 minutes of the alert. The alert had been rehearsed 22 times in the preceding 6 weeks. The compound's personnel were in shelter at 10:36 p.m. and 44 seconds, 3 minutes and 13 seconds after the alert. The Fateh 313 missiles had a time of flight to Baghdad from their Khuzestan launch position of approximately 8 minutes and 50 seconds. The personnel had 5 minutes and 36 seconds of margin before the first potential impact. The Beirut launch, the 6 Zolfaghar missiles, and 4 terrain-following Quds-3 followed at 10:38 p.m., 5 minutes after the Baghdad element. The Zolfaghar launches were detected at 10:38 p.m. and 11 seconds. The terrain-following Quds-3 launches were detected at 10:38 p.m. and 19 seconds, their solid fuel propellant ignitions appearing on the Space Force picture as a separate cluster of thermal signatures from a coastal site north of Jiyeh. The warning reached the Beirut embassy at 10:38 p.m. and 37 seconds. 212 personnel, the compound's full occupancy at that hour, moved to hardened shelter. The American defensive architecture covering the Baghdad International Zone had been substantially reinforced since the first week of the conflict, when the intelligence assessment had rated the embassy compound as among the highest value targets for any IRGC ballistic missile strike in the theater. A dedicated Patriot PAC-3 MSE battery had been positioned within the international zone itself, inside the perimeter, at a location whose geometry gave it the best possible engagement coverage of the eastern approach corridors from which Khuzestan origin missiles would come. A THAAD battery had been repositioned from its standard Al-Udeid support role to a position south of Baghdad 4 days earlier, when the signal's intelligence picture had shifted in the direction of imminent strike activity against Iraqi territory targets. The combined architecture over the Baghdad embassy was not the equal of the Al-Udeid or Juffair installations, but it was substantially more capable than the architecture that had covered the compound in previous weeks. At 10:38 p.m., 5 minutes after the Baghdad launches and the moment the Beirut launches were detected, the THAAD batteries south of Baghdad engaged the 8 Fateh 313 missiles in their mid-course phase. The THAAD's engagement geometry for missiles approaching from the east on a trajectory to the international zone was near optimal. 6 of the 8 Fateh 313 were intercepted between 10:38 p.m. and 10:40 p.m. in 12 seconds. 2 survived the THAAD mid-course layer, their maneuvering re-entry vehicles having executed terminal guidance corrections that placed them at the edge of the battery's optimal coverage arc. The Patriot PAC-3 MSE battery inside the international zone engaged the 2 THAAD survivors at 10:41 p.m. and 33 seconds and 10:41 p.m. and 48 seconds respectively. Shoot doctrine, 2 PAC, 3 MSE per surviving Fateh 313. The first engagement produced a confirmed intercept at 10:41 p.m. and 44 seconds at an altitude of 11,000 feet over the international zone. The debris fell in the Tigris River east of the compound. The second engagement produced a confirmed intercept at 10:41 p.m. and 58 seconds at 9,000 feet. The debris fell in the uninhabited wetland area between the international zone's eastern perimeter and the river. 0 Fateh 313 missiles impacted the Baghdad embassy compound. The Beirut situation was more complex. The Zolfaghar ballistic missiles were addressed by the Patriot battery that had been positioned at Hamat Air Base in northern Lebanon, deployed there 3 weeks earlier when the Lebanese armed forces had formally requested American air defense assistance in managing the escalating threat to Lebanese territory from all directions. The Patriot battery at Hamat was an American system operated by an American crew under a formal defense cooperation agreement with the Lebanese government. Its presence had been the subject of careful diplomatic management, the Lebanese government having requested the capability while being scrupulously careful about the domestic political optics of hosting American military hardware on Lebanese soil. The battery was there. It was operational. The Zolfaghar missiles aimed at the Beirut Embassy gave it its first real combat engagement. 4 of the 6 Zolfaghar missiles were intercepted by the Hamat Patriot battery between 10:43 p.m. and 10:44 p.m. and 30 seconds. 2 Zolfaghar missiles survived the Patriot engagement. The USS Cole, operating in the eastern Mediterranean 46 miles west of the Beirut coastline, had been tracking the Zolfaghar launches from their first detection and had generated SM-2 engagement solutions as a supplementary layer. The Cole fired 2 SM-2 Block 3A missiles at the 2 surviving Zolfaghar warheads at 10:44 p.m. and 12 seconds. Both intercepts were confirmed at 10:44 p.m. and 41 seconds and 10:44 p.m. and 53 seconds respectively. Both Zolfaghar warheads were destroyed over Lebanese territory at altitudes between 8 and 12,000 feet. The debris fields fell in uninhabited mountain terrain northeast of Beirut. The terrain following Quds 3 element was the component that had caused the most concern in the pre-strike defensive planning. 4 cruise missiles, flying through the mountain terrain north of the Bekaa Valley, on a profile that had been specifically designed to avoid the Hamat Patriot battery's radar coverage, approaching the embassy from the northeast through the corridor between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges. The terrain-following profile was based on the same digital terrain database concept that had been employed against Muwafaq, but the Lebanese mountain terrain was more varied and more complex than the eastern Jordanian desert, and the IRGC's guidance team had invested more development time in the Lebanese profile. The Quds 3 route through the mountain corridor had been designed to bring the missiles below the Hamat battery's radar horizon for approximately 70% of their approach. The preparatory step that the IRGC had not anticipated was the deployment, 3 days earlier, of a Sentinel radar system, a compact, highly mobile 3D air surveillance radar, to a position on a ridge in the Lebanese mountains that had been specifically selected by American advisors working with the Lebanese armed forces to provide coverage of the exact corridor the IRGC's terrain-following approach used. The Sentinel's position had been determined through the same intelligence analysis that had characterized the terrain-following Quds 3 program after its first employment against Muwafaq. The lesson of Muwafaq had been, if the IRGC used terrain-following Quds 3 in one theater, they would use the same approach geometry in the next. The analysis of the Lebanese approach corridors had been completed in 4 days. The Sentinel had been positioned on day 5. The 4 terrain-following Quds 3 appeared on the Sentinel radar at 10:45 p.m. and 7 seconds at a range of 22 miles, as they transited a saddle in the terrain corridor that briefly elevated them above the Sentinel's line-of-sight horizon. 22 miles at terminal dash speed, approximately Mach 0.9, meant approximately 110 seconds to the embassy perimeter. The Sentinel's data was transmitted to the Hamat Patriot battery and to the USS Cole simultaneously. The Cole's SM-2 was the faster response. 3 SM-2 missiles fired at 10:45 p.m. and 22 seconds addressed 3 of the 4 Quds 3. All 3 intercepts were confirmed before 10:46 p.m. and 30 seconds. The 4th Quds 3, the one at the southern edge of the corridor, whose approach geometry placed it in the Sentinel's acquisition coverage 1 second later than the others, was assigned to the Hamat Patriot battery. The battery fired a PAC-3 MSE at 10:45 p.m. and 38 seconds. The intercept was confirmed at 10:45 p.m. and 52 seconds. The 4th terrain-following Quds 3 was destroyed at 14 seconds and 7 miles from the Beirut embassy perimeter. At 10:46 p.m., the defensive engagement was complete. 0 weapons had impacted either embassy compound. 0 personnel had been injured at either location. The Baghdad compound's protective shelter was confirmed clear of impacts at 10:47 p.m. when the Regional Security Office duty officer completed her perimeter assessment. The Beirut compound received its all clear at 10:49 p.m.
The response was designated Operation Iron Covenant.
The operational intelligence that had characterized the embassy strike planning, specifically the identification of the intelligence officers within the IRGC's Quds force who had managed the targeting analysis for both embassy strikes, whose planning had been conducted at a facility in southern Tehran that signals intelligence had associated with the operation, was the primary driver of Iron Covenant's target set structure. The strikes were not simply a response to the weapons fired. They were the execution of a targeting package that addressed the planning architecture, the institutional knowledge, and the remaining operational capacity of the IRGC's program for strikes against diplomatic and non-military American targets. The IRGC's decision to cross that line to target embassy compounds housing diplomatic personnel had produced a specific response that addressed not only the weapons that had been fired, but the organization and the people who had made the decision to fire them. The B-2A Spirit bombers assigned to the deepest targets had been airborne since 9 p.m. Pre-positioned on the preliminary alert that had generated at 7:30 p.m., when the Space Force collection had registered the final pre-launch preparation signatures at the Khuzestan Fateh 313 complex. The B-2s carried GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators assigned to the Quds Force planning facility in southern Tehran and to the hardened command node in western Tehran that had been assessed as the primary authorization and coordination point for the embassy targeting operation. The B-2s reached their weapons release points at 12:41 a.m. The GBU-57 assigned to the southern Tehran facility impacted at 12:42 a.m. The seismic signature registered 2.4 magnitude. The second GBU-57, following the progressive defeat sequence at 12:42 a.m. and 42 seconds, registered 2.7 magnitude. The western Tehran command node received its GBU-57 at 12:44 a.m., 2.5 magnitude. The three facilities that had housed the planning, authorization, and coordination of the embassy targeting operation ceased to exist as functional installations within a 2-minute strike window. The Khuzestan launch complexes were addressed by B-1BJASS-MER strikes that arrived between 12:59 a.m. and 1:11 a.m. The GA coastal site from which the terrain following Quds 3 had been launched was addressed by F/A 18F strikes from the USS George H.W. Bush operating in the eastern Mediterranean. The GA site received 8 GBU-38 impacts at 11:44 p.m. The coastal launch infrastructure, the concealed launcher positions, the guidance loading equipment, the communications relay that connected the site to the Tehran command node was assessed as non-recoverable. The IRGC network within Lebanon that had provided the targeting coordination for the Beirut strike, the intelligence collection effort that had characterized the embassy compound's layout, the Hezbollah infrastructure through which the Quds Force had managed its Lebanon-based operations, and the 3 safe houses in the Bekaa Valley that had served as coordination points for the terrain following Quds 3's Lebanese mission profile, were addressed by a coordinated F-35A and F/A-18 F strike beginning at 11:31 p.m. The Lebanese armed forces had been notified of the strike targets through the direct coordination channel that the Hamat Patriot battery deployment had established. The Lebanese government had, in a formal message transmitted at 10:53 p.m., 4 minutes after the Beirut embassy's all clear, requested American action against the Iranian-affiliated infrastructure that had been used to attack Lebanese sovereign territory. The request had been transmitted in both Arabic and English. Its content had been unambiguous. At 1:23 a.m., the Iron Covenant post-strike preliminary assessment reached the CAOC. The assessment confirmed strikes on all designated aim points: the 3 Tehran facilities, the Khuzestan launch complexes, the GA coastal site, and the 7 Lebanon network nodes. The assessment also confirmed the defensive engagement results: 0 impacts on either embassy compound, all personnel accounted for, both compounds operational. The Baghdad Regional Security Office duty officer had already filed her post-event report. The Beirut compound had resumed normal operations at 11 p.m. The diplomatic missions of the United States in both Baghdad and Beirut were conducting their work. At 7 a.m., the Baghdad embassy transmitted its morning situation report to Washington, the routine assessment of the political, security, and operational environment that the mission produced every day. The report noted the previous night's strike attempt, the defensive outcome, and the current status of the compound. It noted 0 personnel casualties, 0 structural damage to the compound's buildings, 0 disruption to the mission's operational functions. The report's assessment section noted that the strike attempt had been the IRGC's most direct targeting of American diplomatic facilities in the conflict, and that its failure to achieve any physical effect had produced a specific kind of strategic signal, that the IRGC's ability to reach American diplomatic personnel in the region had been comprehensively addressed by the defensive architecture, and that the response had addressed the planning and authorization infrastructure that had produced the decision to target embassies. The Beirut embassy's morning reporting was simultaneous. The Beirut political section had spent the overnight hours, after the all-clear at 10:49 p.m. and before the morning reporting cycle, assessing the Lebanese government's response to the night's events. The Lebanese government had, by 7 a.m., issued a public statement condemning the missile strikes on Lebanese sovereign territory and affirming its request for the American response against the launch infrastructure. The statement had been carefully worded. It did not name Iran directly, referring instead to hostile forces that used Lebanese territory as a launch point for attacks on diplomatic facilities. The phrasing was diplomatically useful to the Lebanese government's domestic audience, while being unmistakably clear in its substance to every international reader. The Beirut embassy's political section had assessed the statement as the most direct alignment of Lebanese government public positioning with American security concerns that the conflict had produced, and had flagged it as a significant development in the bilateral relationship's evolution under the pressure of the conflict. The Sentinel radar that had been positioned on the Lebanese mountain ridge 5 days earlier was still operational. Its crew had remained at their station through the engagement and through the night. At 7:15 a.m., the crew transmitted their engagement log and system status to the Air Defense Coordination Center at Hamat. The log recorded the 4 terrain-following Quds 3 detections at 10:45 p.m. and 7 seconds. The track data that had been transmitted to the Hamat Patriot battery and the USS Cole, and the final intercept confirmations. The crew noted, in the observation field of their operational log, that their ridge position had provided the only detection of the Quds 3 element until the missiles were within 22 miles of the target, that without the Sentinel on that ridge, the terrain-following profile would have kept the missiles below the Hamat radar's detection horizon until they were within 11 to 14 miles of the embassy, compressing the engagement timeline to a margin that the post-engagement analysis described as potentially insufficient for confident intercept. The 5-day-old intelligence analysis that had placed the Sentinel on that ridge had been decisive. At the Baghdad embassy, the regional security officer who had activated the protective shelter protocol at 10:33 p.m. and 31 seconds was completing her after-action report. The report noted the protocol execution time, 3 minutes and 13 seconds from alert to full shelter occupancy, and the 7-second improvement over the previous rehearsal's time. It noted the total time in shelter, 13 minutes and 22 seconds, and the absence of any impact on the compound during that time. It noted the compound's current operational status: fully operational, no systems degraded, no repairs required, scheduled maintenance cycle resuming at 8 a.m. The report's final section was titled, "Lessons Identified." The single lesson she recorded was this: the rehearsal schedule worked. The section ended with a sentence that she had been writing at the bottom of her after-action reports since her first tour at a high-threat post 15 years earlier. "We trained for this. It worked. We train again." The compound was secure. The mission continued. In the calculus of strategic coercion, the attack that fails against a defended target does not create leverage. It demonstrates the absence of it.